Acts 25 and 26 today. I think back on different times in history. Think back on different inventions that have come out. I've thought about different times where people thought people were crazy for something and later found out they weren't crazy at all. And sometimes people have great ideas that look nuts at first. And then later you're like, man, that was a really great idea. That got more traction than I thought it would. One of those things that we've seen in the past is this little device, better known as the automobile. Did you know that when the automobile came out, it was not reputed as something that would have any kind of lasting value? Someone said this in a newspaper: the ordinary, quote-unquote, horseless carriage is at present a luxury for the wealthy, and although its price will probably fall in the future, it will never replace the bicycle. Now, interestingly, bicycling's kind of come back, and we're trying to but it's not going to happen. Automobiles are here to stay in one shape or another. Here's another invention that came out: movies with sound. Movies originally had no sound to them. They were silent. This was the first one, 1927. This came out. It had sound with it. It was considered a box office freak. It was considered a gimmick. And it was assumed that the audience would tire of hearing noise as they watched movies, that would never stick. Well, it's done more than stick. I don't really know of any silent, except the movie The Quiet Place, but I've never known of other silent movies since then. Another such invention, in 1973, two engineers from the Motorola company invented what was the first cellular-type mobile phone. And one of the inventors of this device actually said, cellular phones will absolutely not replace wired systems. Even if you project it beyond our lifetimes, it will never be cheap enough for the general public. All right, everybody do something for me. Grab your phone and hold it up. How many phones do we have represented? I'm not seeing any like that in that picture. Do you remember those? Those were awesome. I mean, I always thought, if I can carry something like that around in a mall, I will have arrived. I mean, that's like the sign that you've arrived, one of those cell phones. And then this device, the first airplane. In 1903, the Wright brothers made 4 brief flights in North Carolina. Their father thought they were crazy, and even after all this failure, Wilbur Wright dejectedly proclaimed, "Man will not fly for 50 years." He was wrong. In 1933, the first commercial passenger airliner made its successful journey from point A to point B. And can you imagine life without air travel today? It's completely changed our lives. As I look through these different inventions, I had to think to myself, what great invention do I need to buy some stock in today? Like the automobile. Man, I wish I would have gotten some Tesla a while back, right? Someone's always got an idea. Someone's always there to say that idea is crazy. And then there's times in history where it proves them wrong. And it was actually a really good idea. You know, the Apostle Paul was a brilliant person. But many people thought the Apostle Paul was completely out of his mind. People thought Paul was crazy. I think one of the most compelling things about Paul, and really a compelling proof for Christianity, is the fact that Paul was so brilliant. I mean, renowned genius, studied under the greatest minds in history, dedicated to persecuting the church. Suddenly, turn around. How does a turnaround like that happen? Did he lose his mind? I would say you can't really prove that he lost his mind, because he preaches with such persuasion. He's so cogent in his argumentation. I mean, the guy's not crazy when you hear him write, when you hear him talk. He's brilliant. So how did a man so brilliant change course? It had to have been a miracle. Paul wasn't crazy. As we go through the end of the book of Acts, we're going to find Paul in front of different people. We're going to find Paul in front of different rulers and governors and kings. And chapters 25 and 26 really culminate over here in chapter 26. If you look with me at verse 24. This is the culmination as Paul presents his case, as he preaches to these different rulers, and he's in these different courts and scenarios. In chapter 26, verse 24, he's standing in front of Festus, and Festus cuts him off, and it says, as he was saying these things in his defense, Festus exclaimed in a loud voice, "Paul, you are nuts. You're out of your mind. Too much studying has made you crazy." Was Paul crazy? Are we crazy? What are you giving your life for? How are you living for Christ in your life? Is it crazy to live your life for Jesus Christ? Is it crazy to give your life for Christ? The world thinks so. I'm here to tell you this morning it's not crazy to follow Christ. In fact, I think it's the world that's crazy. I think the world is nuts. I think the world has lost its mind, a la election 2020. And all the confusion, the crazy things that are taking place. I think the world's crazy. And I want you to walk away from this place this morning knowing deep in your heart of hearts, it is not crazy to follow Christ. Let's back up to chapter 25. Let's lead into this proclamation that Festus made to the Apostle Paul. Let's see how it got to this point. Paul, if you remember, has been sitting in prison for 2 years. Felix, the governor, the procurator of Judea, punted on this case. And it's interesting, the different procurators of Judea. You have Pontius Pilate, probably the most famous one. We know of him because of the trials of Jesus Christ, but they kept getting replaced. And Felix, we talked about him last week, now has been replaced by a man named Festus. And it was hard to find a good procurator for Judea because the Jewish people were very tricky to try to rule. Not only did you have a procurator from Rome, but you also had a quote-unquote Jewish king. They weren't always so Jewish, but you had a Jewish king that Rome placed over the Jewish people to help keep them happy. And those Jewish kings were called the Herods, the Herod family. So you've got these different powers that are in play. And so there's a new procurator in town. His name is Festus. Felix has been replaced, and Festus is here. And it says in verse 1 of chapter 25, 3 days after Festus arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. The chief priests and the leaders of the Jews presented their case against Paul to him when they appealed. Now, just think about that for a moment. It's been 2 years since this case was alive. Paul has been in jail in Caesarea. The Jewish people have been sitting on this. There's a new procurator in town. He comes and he visits Jerusalem. Why does he visit Jerusalem? Because he knows it's a hot spot. He knows it's a difficult place to manage. So he goes and visits when he becomes the procurator, and immediately, the Jewish people, man, that is fresh on their minds. They still want to get Paul. After 2 years, they still hate him. They will not let this rest. They go right to Festus and they say, we got to deal with this man. He's been in prison for 2 years, and he's done some terrible things, and we want to see him killed. And they had a good memory. And they were going to keep pushing this thing. And it says in verse 3, asking for a favor against Paul, that Festus summoned him to Jerusalem. And here it goes again. They were, in fact, preparing an ambush along the road to kill him. I mean, this happened 2 years ago. They still want to do this. They still want to kill Paul. Festus, however, answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, that he himself was about to go there shortly. Therefore, he said, let those of you who have authority to go down with me and accuse him if he's done anything wrong. So Festus says, no, we're not going to bring him to Jerusalem. You're going to come to Caesarea. So they come to Caesarea, verse 7. When he arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, and they brought many serious charges that they were not able to prove. Then Paul made his defense. Neither against the Jewish law or against the temple nor against Caesar have I sinned in any way. But Festus, here we go again, same cycle here. Felix did the same thing, wanting to please the Jewish people because they were difficult to please and manage. And he says, but Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, replied to Paul, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem to be tried before me on these charges? What is he asking Paul? Let's go to Jerusalem. Paul, I want to throw you back into the Jewish court. And Paul knew this would be certain suicide. He knew there would be an ambush along the road, or he knew if he was in Jewish court, he wouldn't get a fair trial. He wasn't going to do this. And so in verse 10, Paul replied, I am standing at Caesar's tribunal where I ought to be tried. I have done no wrong to the Jews, even as you yourself know very well. If then I did anything wrong, if I am deserving of death, I'm not trying to escape death. I'm not afraid of death. But if there is nothing to what these men accuse me of, no one can give them to me. I appeal to Caesar. What did Paul do here? Well, Paul knew this was going to be certain death if he went to Jerusalem, so he used a loophole in the law. And we don't know exactly how this worked, or exactly what this meant, but somehow citizens of Rome had this right in certain situations and scenarios to appeal to Caesar, and Paul appeals to Caesar in order to get himself safely to Rome. Jesus has told Paul, you're going to make it to Rome. And some think that maybe Paul shouldn't have done this. Some think that maybe Paul should have just trusted God, that he should have just kind of laid low, and I'm just going to trust God to get me to Rome. But there's always two things going on. When you trust God, it doesn't mean that you just sit, doesn't mean that you do nothing. Sometimes God still wants us to do things actively, do what we can do to help move things along. And here's Paul. He knew he needed to get to Rome. He trusted God to get him to Rome, but at the same time, he knew this would get him to Rome to appeal to Caesar. And it's not bad to work the system. It's not bad to be people that understand the system, that understand how things work. And while we trust God, at the same time, we also use the system the way that it can be used. I've talked in sermons past, that's why we've seen recently there have been certain churches in certain parts of the country that have sued the government to meet. And some people say, well, they shouldn't have done that. They should have just trusted God. Well, this is a great place here in the text of Scripture where we see Paul, he's trusting God, but he's actually using the system that he can use to help save himself and get himself to Rome. So, he appeals to Caesar. Verse 12, after Festus conferred with his council, he replied, you have appealed to Caesar you will go. Problem. What's the problem? Well, we go over to verse 27. And Festus says this in verse 27, for it seems unreasonable to me to send a prisoner without indicating the charges against him. He does not want to send Paul to Caesar without any charges. So what does he do? Well, he needs to get a little more information about how this works, and so he goes to an expert in things Jewish. Who's that expert? Well, the expert's the king of the Judean area, the appointed king. And so we have this character come on the scene in verse 13. Several days later, King Agrippa and Bernice, they come to visit Festus, the newly appointed procurator. King Agrippa. Who is this King Agrippa? Well, it is Herod Marcus Julius Agrippa II. Who was this guy? He's about 30 years old. He's the last Herod that will ever meddle with Christ and his followers again. The Herods had a bad track record of meddling with Christ and his followers. It was his great-grandpa that murdered the male children trying to eliminate Jesus Christ. It was his grand-uncle who murdered John the Baptist. It was his father who executed James and imprisoned Peter, who was later eaten by worms publicly and died under judgment from God for his pride. And now we have the next one in the line of the Herods. Marcus Julius Agrippa II comes with his girlfriend Bernice. Oh, but you need to know a little more about his girlfriend Bernice. You see, his girlfriend Bernice also happens to be his full-blooded sister. You're thinking to yourself, I didn't come to church this morning to hear this, right? Oh, but it gets worse. His full-blooded sister used to be married to her uncle. And that's where Agrippa got her from, was after that marriage was done, he took his sister as his mistress. These are pretty gross people when it comes right down to it. People with no moral compass. And so Festus comes to Agrippa to get a little background on the story, to help him understand exactly what's going on. And so Agrippa, verse 22, says to Festus, I'd like to hear this man myself. Tomorrow you will hear him. He replied. So the next day, Agrippa and Bernice come with great pomp, and they enter the auditorium with the military commanders and the prominent men of the city. You can just see this walking in, and Agrippa and Bernice come, and they're all dressed up in their robes and their crowns, and there's trumpets, you know, and all this pomp and circumstance, and the word actually means fantasia. You can just imagine what the scene was like. All the important people, and they walk in, and they all think they're hot stuff, and look what it says then in verse 23. When Festus gave the command, Paul was brought in. That contrast is intentional by the author, by Luke, to show what these people thought they were in their own minds. They thought they were really hot stuff, and they come and all these people around their robes and their glitz and their glamour, and then Paul comes in, humble prisoner, bound in chains, standing before these people that really think that they are something special. And so Paul begins his defense. Chapter 26. First thing that Paul does in these first few verses is he establishes himself as a Jewish person. Look what it says in verse 1. Agrippa said to Paul, "You have permission to speak for yourself." Then Paul stretched out his hand and began his defense. "I consider myself fortunate that it is before you, King Agrippa. I am to make my defense today against all the accusations of the Jews, especially since you are very knowledgeable about all the Jewish customs and the controversies. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently." What is he saying here? And he says, listen patiently. What he's saying is, buckle your seatbelts because I'm going to preach a long sermon. This is how I plan to start all of my sermons from this point forward. Please listen to me patiently. He's going to give a defense. He's going to give a great defense. He's going to go on and talk for a long time. We don't know how long this was. Most likely Luke abridged these speeches a little bit. The first thing he does in this speech is he attaches himself to the Jewish religion because it was important that Paul made sure that the leaders knew that this was not a separate sect of the Jewish religion, that it was a fulfillment of the Jewish religion. And this is the crux of the issue, verse 6, "And now I stand on trial because of the hope in what God promised to our ancestors, the promise our 12 tribes hope to reach as they earnestly serve Him by night and day. King Agrippa, I'm being accused by the Jews because of this hope. Why do any of you consider it incredible that God raises the dead?" He says, you know this is part of our scriptures. You know that resurrection is part of what we believe. Why do you find that incredible? This is what I'm in trial for, is actually believing in the hope that supposedly we all believe in the resurrection of the dead. Well, he goes on and says, I used to be a persecutor of Christians. And this really adds some gravitas to his argument, because here he stands not as a born and bred Christian, but someone who is actually opposing Christianity at one point, that flipped around, that changed. And what was it that caused that change in Paul's heart and his mind? And he tells that story here in verse 13. It says, "King Agrippa, while on the road at midday, I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, shining around me and those traveling with me. We all fell to the ground, and I heard a voice speaking to me in Aramaic. 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard to kick against the goads.' I asked, 'Who are you, Lord?' And the Lord replied, 'I am Jesus, the one you are persecuting.'" Why did Paul change from persecutor to proclaimer? The reason he changed is because Jesus appeared to him on the road, a resurrected Jesus Christ. And just listen to this commission. I love how Paul says it. This is our commission as well, my friends. This is what Jesus says to us as well. This is our job to do as Christians. It says, "I am Jesus, the one you are persecuting, but get up, stand to your feet." The contrasts are great. I appeared to you, Paul, so stand up, get on your feet. "For I have appeared to you for this purpose, to appoint you as a servant and witness of what you have seen and what you will see of me." Paul, you're going to be a witness of what you know and what you're going to know and what I'm going to show you in the future. "I will rescue you from your people. I will rescue you from the Gentiles. And I'm going to rescue you to send them to them." And what are you going to do when you go to them? Verse 18, "I want you to help open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light, from the power of Satan to God." Paul, I want you to go preach to people in their craziness, because the world is nuts and they need to know Jesus. That's what I want you to do. And look what it says at the end of verse 18, "that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a share among those who are sanctified by faith in me." That's your commission, Paul. That's what made Paul so crazy. He was crazy to go preach truth in life and resurrection. Look down at verse 23, "that the Messiah must suffer, and that, as the firstborn to rise from the dead, he would proclaim light to our people and to the Gentiles." Paul, I want you to preach me. I want you to preach Christ. I want you to preach the fact that when people trust in Jesus, to pay the penalty for their sins, that when they trust and believe that Jesus died on the cross for their sins, that they receive perfect righteousness, that they receive a righteous standing before a holy God, so that when God sees them, he no longer sees their sin, but he sees Jesus' righteousness applied to them, and they stand in life, and they look forward to the resurrection of the dead someday, and they have life, and they have a hope, and they have a reason to live. Do you think that's crazy? I don't. I think that makes sense. And Paul thought that makes sense. And Paul preached this message to these rulers who sat in judgment over him. And it culminates in verse 24. As he was saying these things, he got cut off. And Festus is like, enough is enough, in a loud voice. He proclaims, "You are out of your mind, Paul. Too much studying is driving you mad." And look at his response. Paul replied, "I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus. On the contrary, I am speaking words of truth and good judgment." So are we out of our minds? Are we crazy because of what we believe? I want to just take a few moments to apply some things from this text this morning, because I think it's important for us to understand that we are not crazy to follow Christ. Let me just point some things out to you this morning. Number one, I want you to understand here from this text of Scripture that it's not crazy to reject worldly pleasures for Christ. It is not crazy to reject worldly pleasures for the cause of Christ. The contrasts in this text couldn't be more poignant. Felix, Festus, Agrippa, Bernice, they all thought they were big shots. They all thought they were hot stuff. They all thought they were making a huge imprint in human history. Just for fun, as I was prepping for this sermon, I went onto Wikipedia and I looked up Festus. About 3 or 4 paragraphs. I looked up Marcus Julius Agrippa II. He was a really weird dude, but he had a cool name. You got to give him that, right? Just a few paragraphs. Then on Wikipedia, I looked up the Apostle Paul. You know what I found? Paragraph after paragraph after paragraph after paragraph after paragraph. Here these rulers sat with all their robes and all their material goods and all the soldiers and all these people that thought they were really something else, looking down their noses at little prisoner Apostle Paul, the crazy man who preached Christ. But who was it that actually had the bigger imprint in human history? By far it was Paul. Why? Because he was not afraid to lay aside and reject worldly pleasures for the cause of Christ. He knew what his mission was. He knew his mission wasn't to gain material goods in this world. He knew his mission was not to try to live for this world, but it was to live for Christ, because that was the only thing that was going to last beyond this life. As I think about those rulers walking in and all their pomp and all the clothing and everything, and it just kind of reminded me of watching like a Hollywood awards show. How many of you have ever watched a Hollywood awards show? Let me see your hands. And now you're sorry for it. Keep your hands up, right? I've watched bits and pieces of those, and some of it's just for the entertainment value, but you watch these people walk in like Bernice, like Agrippa, looking all nice on the outside, but having horrible personal lives, having deep, destructive sins in their lives. They walk the red carpet, and they're all trying to impress each other with their displays of fashion. They sit down in these seats and they laugh at different things that are happening, and people walk up and they get awards and they clap for someone that won an award, then they whisper to each other, they should have really won those awards. You see the gossip going on, and it's just like high school all over again. Just all the drama. Like, you're supposed to be grown adults. And I look at those people, I don't see grown adults. I see people with great sadness in their eyes. They may have fame, they may have fortune, but I see people who are desperately lost and hurting and have disasters of personal lives. Many of them have to spend 8 hours a day in the psychiatrist's office just to make a go of life, because Their lives are a mess. Why? Because they're living for things that will pass away. That'll make your life a mess. That'll make life not worth living. When you realize all this stuff that I'm doing, all these things that I'm living for, it's all going to pass away, that's depressing. No wonder why they struggle personally. And I just think of that scene, those types of shows, and I think of the scene of the Apostle Paul standing before these people that thought they really had life by the tail. And when in actuality, it was the Apostle Paul that was speaking words of truth and life and resurrection. I want you to see, secondly, it is not crazy to continue to preach the truth to hard soil. It is not crazy to keep preaching the truth to hard soil. I look at Paul, he walks in here, he had time in front of Felix, he has this time in front of Festus, he has the time in front of King Agrippa. All these people are hardened people to the gospel. They really don't want to hear. Yet Paul just kept preaching. If I was Paul, I'm not sure if I would have that kind of stamina. If I was Paul, I might walk into this scenario and I might try to do whatever I could to make them like me. How about you? If I was Paul, I'd maybe try to do whatever I could to get myself out of this pickle. Yet every time Paul stands in front of some of these rulers, he preaches truth and he preaches judgment to them. And he lets them have the truth because he continued to persevere preaching to hardened soil, people that had very little chance of ever turning to Christ. He just kept at it even though he knew he might fail. Remember when I was a kid, I think I was in junior high, I tried to learn to juggle once because I thought that would be cool. Maybe I could have a career in juggling. I didn't know. I tried and tried and tried, and finally one day, I still failed. That didn't go where you thought it was going to go, did it? I still can't juggle. And there's sometimes you do things that you just know are bound for failure. And I just have to wonder in the Apostle Paul's mind here as he stands and he preaches again to another ruler. He preaches his heart out. Is this even useful at all? Yet he didn't know who was listening. He didn't know who else was in the room that could hear the message. He just kept preaching because he knew that he had a message of life and hope. Years ago, there was a young man who ran for the legislature in a large state, and he was badly defeated. He next entered business. He failed and spent 17 years paying debts. He was in love with a beautiful woman and finally was engaged to her, but she died. Re-entering politics, he ran for Congress but was badly defeated. Then he tried to get an appointment to the U.S. Land Office but failed. He became a candidate for the U.S. Senate but was badly defeated. 2 years later, he was defeated again, and it was one failure after another, but he refused to give up, and eventually he became the President of the United States. His name was Abraham Lincoln. I read that story about Abraham Lincoln. I just thought of the Apostle Paul standing before these degenerate people, continuing to faithfully preach the gospel. And friends, please know in your life, it's never a waste of time to keep preaching the gospel. It's never a waste of time to keep preaching the truth to what you might think is hard soil. You never know how God is going to use it, and we should always share truth with the expectation that God will use it some way and somehow. Thirdly, I want you to see this morning, it is not crazy to believe in a resurrection. It is not crazy to believe in a resurrection. Paul says it in verse 8 of chapter 26. Why do any of you consider it incredible that God raises the dead? Why is he saying that to them? Because they know, they've seen, they've heard the news about Jesus. You couldn't keep this hidden. They've believed the prophets. They've been around the prophets for a long time. He says it again in verse 23 that the Messiah must suffer, and that as the first to rise from the dead, he would proclaim light to our people and to the Gentiles. He keeps preaching the resurrection, and he's not crazy to preach the resurrection. One great historian and academic once said this. I love this quote. No fact of ancient history is so well attested as the resurrection. Nobody would even think of doubting it except for the fact that it's supernatural. The reason I quote that is because I want you all to know here this morning we are not crazy to believe in the resurrection, that it is a very well-attested fact from history. The only reason anybody doubts it is because it's a miracle. It is not crazy to believe in a resurrection. You see, the message of the resurrection is a message that people need to hear. It's a message that people want to hear because it's a message of life. And that's what everybody's trying to find. That's what people are living their lives to find. They're trying to find life. They're trying to find a hope. They're trying to find something that makes sense. And the resurrection is life. The resurrection is hope. The resurrection is something that we can stand upon in this crazy life. And people, whether they know it or not, they believe in a resurrection. Everybody believes in a resurrection. Deep in their hearts, I believe they know that it's true. You see it. You see people desperately trying to ward off the signs and the processes of aging. Just go to any gym in the Des Moines area, right? You see people desperately trying to keep themselves fit. When our hair goes gray, what do? We color it. Why? Because we're desperately trying to push off the processes of aging, right? We want to hang on to life. Why do we want to hang on to life? Because I think deep in the human heart, God has placed the knowledge of the resurrection. God has put into the heart of man, this is not it. This life is not all that there is. There is more out there. And people are trying to hang on to that hope. Thousands of years ago, the Egyptians used to mummify people, and the reason they did that was in hopes of a future resurrection, to keep that body intact so it could be resurrected. We look back and like, that's nuts. Why would you do that? Well, today, did you know that there's something called cryogenics? That people actually have their bodies frozen after they die, and then they pay for storage at storage units for these bodies. There are bodies stored, and the reason people do this, they pay for this, is so that someday, maybe a couple hundred years from now, the technology will develop to bring that body back to life. People actually are putting their hope into technology like cryogenics. And I went to one website, a cryogenic website, and the tagline on their website was this: your last best hope for life. You think we're crazy? That's nuts. Why do people do that? Because in here, we all know we were created as eternal beings. It is not crazy to preach the resurrection of the dead. We know it. And Paul says that, starting in verse 24. Look at his response. Festus says, "You're crazy." Oh, really? Look at verse 25. Paul replied, "I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus. On the contrary, I am speaking words of truth and good judgment." I love how he says that in verse 25, and we need to know that, friends. What we have here are words of truth and good judgment. Look what he says to Festus and King Agrippa. For the king knows. The king knows about these matters, and I can speak boldly to him, for I am convinced that none of these things has escaped his notice. What things? Oh, the fact that there was a man that magically escaped out of a tomb several years earlier. That God is doing miracles, that God is building this church. Verse 27, King Agrippa, I love how he corners him. Do you believe in the prophets? Agrippa, do you believe in the prophets? Look what he says next. I know you believe. How does Agrippa get out of this moment? I think Paul looked in his eyes. I think Paul could see the conviction of the Holy Spirit starting to fall. I think Paul knew he was getting through. Look what Agrippa says in verse 28. Agrippa said to Paul mockingly, "You going to persuade me to become a Christian so easily? You think you can waltz in here? You think I'm just going to believe?" Look at the tenacity of Paul. "Man, I wish before God," replied Paul, "that whether easily or with difficulty, not only you, but all who listen to me might one day become as I am." I wish, yes, that I could persuade you to become a believer in Jesus Christ. The king, the governor, Bernice, and those sitting with him got up when they had left. They talked with each other and said, "This man has not done anything to deserve death or imprisonment." Agrippa said to Festus, "This man could have been released if he had not appealed to Caesar." Case over. Let's get this man out of here. You can just kind of see the conviction falling. We're done. We don't want to hear him anymore. Paul delivered this message of hope to those who were standing. Man, Paul's response is awesome. It almost just makes me want to weep just thinking of Paul standing there in front of these people that thought they were such big shots. In the scope of history, they were nothings. They were zeros in the scope of history. They thought they had something. They had nothing. Paul was preaching the message of life and hope to these people. And he stands and faithfully preaches to hard soil a message of the resurrection. Was Paul crazy? I don't think so. Are we crazy? I don't think so. You know, sometimes though as a Christian you maybe have those moments of doubt. I think every Christian at some point in your life you've had maybe the thought cross your mind, is all this actually real? Is all this real? But as soon as you have a thought like that, you counter that with, well, what's the alternative? I don't see people out in the world really living lives of hope in finding a better way. When I really examine the evidence, and I think about the evidence of the resurrection of the dead, and I think about the fact that we all want to hold on to life, I think about all these things together, I realize, no. We have the words of truth in life. We have those. We are not the crazy ones. Recently, there was a letter found that was written by a man who died in the crash of the Titanic. He was a pastor. His name was John Harper. This letter recently was just auctioned off in the UK for a large sum of money. He was traveling with his 6-year-old daughter and his sister, traveling to Chicago to preach when the Titanic struck the iceberg on that fateful night. The call was made for the passengers to evacuate their cabins, and Harper wrapped his 6-year-old daughter up in a blanket. He placed her in a lifeboat. He said, I'm going to see you again someday. He took off his life jacket. He gave up his spot on the lifeboat. And for 2 hours, he ran up and down the deck of the ship, preaching Christ to people who were about to die. He finally succumbed to the icy waters. And as he was dying of hypothermia, he went to every live person he could find struggling in the waters and continued to preach Christ to people who were dying. Years later, a young man gave a testimony in church and said that this pastor came to him in the waters that night and he gave his life to Christ as he was about to die, but then he was snatched out of the water by a lifeboat and saved. He was John Harper's last convert. So who is crazy? John Harper? Or the thousands of passengers that were desperately trying to hang on to any shred of life that they could find in those moments before they died? I don't think John Harper was crazy. I think he had the message of life and hope to give people. And friends, we live in a world that is sinking. Do you realize that? Friends, this world is a Titanic disaster. Pun intended. This world's going down. Who are the crazy ones? The ones that are trying to still find some shred of life here in this world, find something to live for, or are we the ones with the right message, preaching to people that, man, this ship's going down? You better know Christ, because he is the only hope for this life and the next.